This is the lecture for European history for Thursday, the 19th of May, 2021. So, we have talked about the turning point battle on the Eastern Front in World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. We will return to talking about it when we talk about the casualties inflicted in World War II. It is the, by far, worst urban battle in human history. The most costly urban battle in human history thus far. Now we shift to the east, to the Pacific Ocean. You've got Japan, you've got the mainland of Asia, including Korea, you've got the Chinese coast, Indochina, Hainan Island, the independent country of Taiwan, got Okinawa, and down here to Singapore and so forth. We've got a better job with Japan. Hokkaido. You've got the Philippine Islands over here, which actually just trying to do this too quickly. Taiwan, Okinawa, Philippines, and you've got the East Indies and so forth. I don't need to go that far south. Okay. Here's Hawaii. Here's the island of Midway, which is part of the Hawaiian chain, a little bit removed. Ah, I've got to actually do that. Got the island of New Guinea. Got Australia. What?
You should draw it upside down.
It's not upside down. Tasmania's down here. You got the East Coast. No, it's not perfect, but it's not bad for a completely free-form drawing.
Guys, be nice to Mr.
I was saying you should draw it upside down. That's Australia.
Ah.
Oh, ha ha ha.
Upside down.
Okay, you got a variety of Indonesian islands, including Sulawesi or Celebes. You got Borneo.
How do you feel about shrimp?
Where's Java? Here's Sumatra. And we've got the Singapore area.
I gotta be good today.
And up
Kinda
to
pushing it.
there. Yeah, my proportions off a little bit. Fine.
Did he tell you guys about that? Oh, no, you guys don't have that.
So here's the Malay Peninsula. Here's Southeast Asia.
Hey.
Here's China. It's still not good. I want to do one more thing here. An organized person would have drawn this in advance, but organization is...
Wait, didn't we already draw that one?
Okay. Ah!
Indeed,
New
I
Britain,
am.
New Ireland, Solomon Islands, and Guadalcanal. Okay. Japan has sunk the American battle force, and in doing so has restricted U.S. options in the Pacific War quite mightily. Without a battle force, without battleships, and without anything like equivalent numbers, even in aircraft carriers, the United States Navy is absolutely on the defensive. The Japanese, for the next 6 months, with their Kido Butai, take the Philippines, they take Thailand, they take Burma, they take the Dutch East Indies, and they are a force that seems to be unstoppable. They raid Sri Lanka, which is called Ceylon back then, south of India, and they even threaten Madagascar. However, there is a decision made by President Roosevelt to punish the Japanese with a psychological slap in the face, something that the Japanese will not expect. His wish to do that comes true with an idea by very innovative Army and Navy airmen. The American fleet still has aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The newest of them is the Yorktown-class aircraft carrier USS Hornet. It's slightly larger than any of our other carriers. General Billy Mitchell, after World War I, an advocate of air power from the U.S. Army, said that future wars would come as a result of aerial victories and bombing. And to prove this, he actually demonstrated that even primitive 1920 aircraft could sink a German battleship that was given to the United States after World War I. And he was ultimately court-martialed because he wouldn't shut up about this. It was a nasty political move. One of his devotees, his disciples, a guy named Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, proposes to launch American two-engine medium bombers, B-25 Mitchells, named after Billy Mitchell, from the decks of an American aircraft carrier. Aircraft carriers would move the airfield close enough to good targets, and the range of the bombers would be like nothing the Japanese would expect. Aircraft carrier aircraft tend to have a much more limited range than land bombers. Now, obviously, these bombers could not land again on a carrier deck. It's an open question whether they'll be able to take off from one. So, it's going to be a one-way mission. And the idea is to launch an attack on the city of Tokyo, where the emperor lives, where the government is, from outside the range the Japanese would expect. Hit Tokyo, and then fly on and land in nationalist areas of mainland China, which was our ally at this point. Yes, Americans shed blood for the Chinese people, a lot of it, in World War II. In southern China, in fact, there was the American volunteer group known as the Flying Tigers, wrong color, that were American volunteers fighting for China. So the thought is that the Chinese people, who largely are anti-Japanese, would be friendly and help the Americans get out of China, get to India, and back to the United States. So this is the plan. Launch, bomb Tokyo, get to China. Doolittle practices in a land airfield that is much shorter than it needs to be. Practices takeoffs. The planes are absolutely aligned to carry maximum fuel, some bombs, to give them the lightest takeoff weight they can have, but still do the mission, drop bombs on Tokyo, and get to China. So the USS Enterprise, carrying fighter aircraft, is going to escort the USS Hornet, carrying these Army bombers. And in the spring of 1942, as the carriers are approaching their takeoff point, they're still several hours away, a Japanese Maru gets close enough to see the carriers. A Maru is a Japanese merchant ship, fishing vessel actually, and sends a message by radio. Now we jam the message, but we cannot be sure that the Maru's message didn't get through. If the Maru's message got through, the two American aircraft carriers are approaching the Japanese coast. There'd be no surprise. The Japanese fleet would come out to pursue us, and the Japanese fighter defenses would be in the air waiting. So a decision is made by Doolittle and by the fleet commander not to wait, not to launch when expected, but to launch a few hours early. This is going to reduce the flight, the ability of the airmen to definitely make it to China, but it's a risk the airmen are willing to take. Colonel Doolittle's plane is the first to take off. What they have to do is the aircraft carriers turn into the wind and go to flank speed, maximum speed. This creates the maximum amount of airflow over the flight deck. The bombers are basically revving on the flight deck with chocks holding their tires in place. And when the ship is down and about to come up, the first plane is released, so that when it gets here, the plane is actually tossed up by the wave motion of the ship. Doolittle's plane successfully takes off. He has the shortest run, and his fellow pilots all take off and follow. The American carrier force and their cruiser escorts immediately about face, and head back to Hawaiian waters as quickly as possible to avoid getting slapped by the Japanese fleet. Tokyo is not expecting what's about to happen. Out of nowhere, groups, I can't call them formations, of American medium bombers appear at wave top level over Tokyo and go over the city. Now, these bombers have orders absolutely not to bomb anything even near the Imperial Palace. If we kill the emperor in an air attack, the Japanese people will be absolutely impossible to deal with. To win the war, we'll have to kill all of them. So we don't threaten the emperor intentionally at all. We make sure that our targets are away from the Imperial Palace. We hit some factories, we hit a few civilian targets by accident, and our planes move on. Now, a few planes are shot down over Japan. The fate of the air crews is typically that they're brought in front of a crowd and beheaded with samurai swords. Some of the planes land in Japanese territory. Those pilots who are captured by the Japanese meet the same fate. But a number of planes, a surprisingly large number of planes, make it to mainland China and link up with the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists who are our allies, who are fighting the Japanese. And Colonel Doolittle and the vast majority of his pilots are brought back to the United States to continue fighting. The Japanese reaction to this is apoplectic. It is as strong in its own way as the reaction to Commodore Perry's arrival in 1854, when the Americans show up with relatively modern fleets and modern marines and demonstrate to the Japanese something the Americans don't fully understand yet. They could have threatened the emperor's life. If those bombers had wanted to, bless you, or if luck had intervened, the emperor, the entire imperial family could have been dead. Now, Japan has the oldest unbroken dynasty in world history, going back to prehistoric mythical times, to the time of Jimmu Tenno, and ultimately to the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami. The thought of losing the imperial family is beyond the ability of the Japanese to comprehend. Their whole purpose as a people, as a nation, is to protect this God and serve this living God. That is their identity. And American bombers could have done it. So the government and the fleet react with fury. Yes? No, go ahead.
I just have a comment.
Okay. So, a rather ambitious plan by Admiral Yamamoto is going to be adopted. Up here is the Aleutian Islands that stick out from Alaska. You see Alaska over there near the left side of the map. You see that bunch of islands heading off below it. That's the Aleutian Islands. And the Aleutian Islands go into the Eastern Pacific as well. Or Western Pacific. You can see them over here, this sort of arc of islands heading towards Siberia, towards the Kamchatka Peninsula. Here's the plan. So Australia's not good enough. Oh, okay, fine. There we go. That's a little better.
Of course it's not upside down, Sam, because it's not really upside down.
That's confusing.
So, what the Japanese are going to do is they are going to launch feint attacks on Dutch Harbor, the regional capital of the Aleutian Islands, air attacks. And they're going to take the islands of Kiska and Attu. Attu and Kiska are two of the westernmost Aleutian Islands. So this is a Japanese air raid on Alaska and Japanese invasion of American territory. It's not state yet, it's territory, but still. What this is intended to do is draw the U.S. fleet north, out of position. When that happens, while the U.S. fleet is at sea planning on going to Alaska, the Japanese will hit and invade the island of Midway. Now, the island of Midway is within bombing range of Pearl Harbor. If the Japanese take Midway, which has a good airfield and a bunch of goony birds, which are basically giant, big, gloomy seagulls, the Japanese can place land-based bombers on Midway, and they can bomb Pearl Harbor at will. They can also set up an invasion force using Midway as the staging area. The Americans simply cannot allow the Japanese to occupy Midway. So the American fleet is going to have to divert from Alaska to Midway to fight what Mahan called a decisive battle, a battle like the Battle of Trafalgar. The Japanese have 7 or 8 battleships. They have 6 heavy aircraft carriers and a bunch of light aircraft carriers. They have close to 20 cruisers. They have close to 80 destroyers in their combined fleet. The Americans have 3 aircraft carriers. No battleships, maybe 8 or 9 cruisers, and maybe 20 or 30 destroyers. The American fleet is completely outclassed. Once the Japanese destroy the rest of the Pacific Fleet, the United States will be forced to come to terms and make peace on the basis of Japan controlling Asia. That's the plan. However, there's going to be a preliminary action. The Japanese drive southward needs to prepare for an invasion of Australia. The city of Port Moresby on the southeastern region of New Guinea is going to be a necessary staging area for that invasion. So the Japanese send a preliminary attack with 2 of their aircraft carriers, Shokaku and Zoikaku, with a bunch of troop ships into the Coral Sea, with the intent of going to Port Moresby and taking it from the Aussies and setting up a base to attack Australia. American code breakers, a bunch of math nerds who understand Japanese and understand cryptography, have actually done remarkable work at breaking various Japanese codes, Japanese naval codes. And they think an attack is going to happen in Coral Sea. So the Americans actually take 2 of their 4 aircraft carriers, the old carrier Lexington and the new carrier Yorktown, south to meet the Japanese. And they come into contact at Coral Sea not by having their ships meet, but the aircraft meet. Various air scouts on both sides spot each other's aircraft carriers. And this is the first naval battle in human history where the opposing ships don't even see one another. Instead, the ranges are several hundred miles. We sink a Japanese light carrier. The Japanese paced the Lexington and the Yorktown. They think they've sunk both of them. Shokaku and Zoikaku lose a bunch of pilots, but their ships are relatively undamaged. The Lexington sinks. The Yorktown is saved. American damage control in World War II is superior to anyone else's. We're really good at saving our ships once they've been hit. The Yorktown goes back to Pearl Harbor. What should be 3 months of repairs are done in 3 days. The ship is made battle-worthy because the codebreakers say that there's going to be an attack somewhere. Could be on the West Coast, could be Alaska, could be anywhere. But they do a test. They send a courier to Midway with orders to send this radio message in the clear, not in code. There is a problem with our freshwater converter. Freshwater converters allow you to take ocean water, desalinate it, and drink from it. You had something earlier.
Yeah, I wanted to say something about planes landing on carriers that shouldn't land on carriers. I think it was the 60s. The Air Force landed the C-130.
Yeah, but the forestall's big.
Well, yeah, it was big for the time. Yeah.
For the time, yeah.
Yeah.
That's not easy to do, though. I'm sure there wasn't much cargo in the C-130.
I think they used rockets to slow it down.
Yeah. That's on the order of a stunt. You can do stunts in the military, but no, you never want to have a real supply run where you're flying a C-130, which is a big transport.
The whole idea behind it was in case that we can't supply the ship at sea with our unrep ships, underway replenishment ships,
Mhm.
can land a C-130 on it.
Yeah, no. You'd be better dropping parachutes full laden with stuff, and heavy ships pick them up. Okay. Now, the codebreakers think that objective AF, Alpha Foxtrot, is Midway. But having Midway send that there's a problem with their freshwater converter, oddly enough, works. The Japanese send a message in code, objective AF is having trouble with their freshwater converter, we should bring extra stocks of fresh water. Now we know it's Midway. Because we know it's Midway, the two uncommitted U.S. carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, end up waiting off of the northeast of Midway, waiting for the Japanese attack. The Americans are not going to be diverted to Alaska. We know it's a feint. The Japanese forces approach Midway from the northwest behind a weather front, and they start launching air attacks on Midway. These air attacks involve land bombs, not torpedoes, not armor-piercing bombs. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs are useful against warships at sea. Land bombs are basically thin cases with lots of explosive, useful against land targets. The Japanese meet some Marine Corps fighters that are Brewster Buffaloes. I told you about them. They all get shot down. Most of the pilots get killed. The Japanese bomb Midway. One of the most famous Hollywood directors of the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, a guy named John Ford, is actually on Midway making a film about life there, and he does footage of the Japanese attack. He doesn't duck and dive for cover. He's a gutsy guy. And the Japanese planes are returning to their four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. Now, they're in a vulnerable moment. They've got a second wave of Midway fighters getting ready to launch land bombs under their decks and their hangars. They've got their planes returning that they're going to need to land because they're running out of fuel. American carriers are detected by their scout forces where they're not supposed to be. American carriers are detected near Midway. American carriers within range. By the way, the Yorktown, having been repaired in 3 days, has joined these other two. So now it's 3 carriers to 4. It's more reasonable odds. Also, the Japanese have dispersed their fleet all over the Pacific as they approach. Instead of having their fleet in one combined mass, they've got their carriers up here, they've got their landing ships here, they've got their battleships back here. So in the battle with the carriers, the rest of the Japanese fleet is irrelevant. What to do? The commander of Kidobutai, Admiral Nagumo, has a choice to make. Nagumo's an old man. He's not a flyer. He's a battleship commander. He is reflexively cautious. But in this case, Nagumo chooses to gamble. He orders the retrieval of all the planes from Midway. They're going to land. And the rearming of the planes that he has already had armed for land attack with sea attack weapons. So for the next half hour or so, the Japanese fleet will only have its fighter protection in the air. All the rest of their planes will be either landing and refueling and being armed to attack sea targets, or being rearmed from land weapons to sea weapons to attack sea targets. It's a gamble. The likelihood that Americans will attack during this critical window is minuscule. However, squadrons of American torpedo bombers, flying low and slow at wave-top level, begin to attack the Japanese carriers. The fighter protection, the combat air patrol of the Japanese carriers, dives down to shoot down all of the American torpedo bombers. Only one pilot, Ensign George Gay, survives this slaughter. He's in his Mae West floaty thing, life preserver, and a raft in the midst of this battle. He witnesses all of it. and survives, is picked up by a submarine later. Now, one of the reasons I believe in God is there are certain unlikely events in history that are completely violations of the laws of chance. It's not the only reason, it's not the major reason, but it is a reason. And what happens at the Battle of Midway is one of those things. Had the torpedo bombers not sacrificed themselves, the combat air patrol of the Japanese protecting the carriers would have been high in the sky where they belong. Instead, they were down at wave-top level, shooting down the remainder of the torpedo planes. The Japanese fleet had no air protection up high. And at that point, dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Hornet, and later the Yorktown, arrive within a 5-minute period. And in that 5-minute period, they dive on all 4 Japanese carriers, sinking 3 of them, damaging the 4th. The Japanese decks are filled with fuel, with bombs. They are like fireworks shacks surrounded by gasoline tanks with liquefied natural gas sprinkled on it. The Japanese carriers explode and burn. Nagumo has to flee his flagship and set up in a destroyer for a while. 3/4 of the Japanese carriers gone. Their air crews gone. A few hours later, the Yorktown is hit by the last carrier, and the last carrier is hit by planes of the Yorktown. Both ships are sunk. Now, the Americans have 2 aircraft carriers left. The Japanese have none. The Japanese have a major surface force. The Japanese have troops close to Midway. They all turn around rather than move into an area dominated by American land aircraft and American carrier aircraft. Now, this is why it's so important. In America, aircraft carrier pilots are a job. It's a job. It's a highly skilled job. It's a high status job, but it's a job. So in America, especially after the war begins, thousands of men are trained to be pilots. They're given a 90-day course on how to be an officer and a gentleman. They're given pilot training. And their pilot training is pretty good because fully 1/3 of all the experienced naval aviators in the fleet are on the shore training new pilots. So of the experienced aviators, 1/3 are on shore training other pilots. 1/3 are preparing to go to sea, and 1/3 are at sea. We have far more pilots than the Japanese as soon as the war reaches its 2nd year, as soon as it's 1943. Because we keep training more and more, and because our pilots who are exposed to danger at sea is only 1/3 of our force. The Japanese don't see it that way. To the Japanese, being a fighter pilot or a bomber pilot on a carrier is like being a samurai. It is a vocation. You're chosen for this at age 11, 12, or 13. And you do nothing with your life but train to fly these planes. So when the flight crews of 4 of the 6 Japanese carriers, and actually the 5th was also pretty badly damaged at Coral Sea, are killed all at once, the talent pool that the Kido Butai has used is gone. Those pilots, their life experiences, their tricks of the trade are all lost. From this point, Japan cannot win the war. The Battle of Midway is a turning point battle in that without the ability to replace that talent pool of pilots, it is only a matter of time until Japan will be defeated. It's not yet assured that America will win, but it is assured that Japan won't. This happens 6 months after Pearl Harbor on June 4th, 5th, 1942. Almost exactly as Yamamoto had predicted it. Now I'm going to show you some clips of what films say that this sort of air-sea battle looked like. Will you get the shades, the lights, please? Yeah, please. I think the fan is off.
Hands off.
Oh, the camera. Yes, because I don't want to claim credit for making the movie Midway, which I didn't make. But now nobody will have any doubt. On to low. So we just saw some clips from the movie Midway, which show you a bit of the visual and sound and fury of an air-sea battle. I also showed you a scene where an American pilot chooses to say no rather than allow himself to be interrogated and used by the Japanese against his comrades. But Midway doesn't win the war in the Pacific. It simply prevents the Japanese from winning. Here is the island of Guadalcanal, actually much smaller than this. Guadalcanal is at the end of what are called the Solomon Islands. Japanese, soon after Midway, build an airstrip here. With that airstrip, they will make it much more difficult to send supplies to Australia and New Zealand. And it can be used as a jumping off point for other islands in this area, New Caledonia, the Hebrides, and so forth, Santa Cruz Islands up here. So even though the strategy arranged between the British and the Americans is Europe first, Hitler first, the Americans come up with enough resources to launch the first attack of the war. In August of 1942, the 1st Marine Division of the United States lands on Guadalcanal. The airfield is still being built. The construction workers and troops guarding it flee into the hills. The Americans christen the field Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a man who was killed at Midway. American supplies begin to be landed, and American planes are flown in. The code name of the island is Cactus. These planes are going to be known as the Cactus Air Force. However, by the second night, a Japanese column of cruisers inflicts the largest defeat in American naval history up to that point, the First Battle of Savo Island, sinking half a dozen major fleet combatants, light and heavy cruisers, forcing the American aircraft carriers to flee. There's going to be a seesaw battle for the island of Guadalcanal from August of 1942 until February of 1943. It's not Stalingrad, but it happens at the exact same time. Like Stalingrad, the Battle of Guadalcanal sees the Japanese and the Americans fighting at the edge of their ability to send resources. Like Stalingrad, the Americans and Japanese commit to not losing this battle. Like Stalingrad, it is a bloodbath for both sides, but at a much smaller scale. And like Stalingrad, after so many ships are sunk in the harbor north of Guadalcanal that it is known today as Iron Bottom Sound. You can't use a compass anywhere near there because the amount of steel in the water is going to destroy your compass reading. And it is a site for many modern salvagers because steel made before the dropping of the first atomic bomb does not have a background radioactive level, which all steel made since the dropping of the first atom bomb does. So ships of this era, which were sunk before the test bomb at Alamogordo, New Mexico, and the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and all the bombs that were exploded after that, don't have this. So they are extremely valuable for making precision equipment. Yeah.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
Radioactive, all steel made since the first explosion of an atomic bomb is somewhat affected by background radiation increasing in the atmosphere. What that does is it makes the steel somewhat radioactive, and that denies its ability to act in detection of radiation and other things. So for certain precision detection gear and equipment, you have to find pre-atomic steel. And the best place to find pre-atomic steel is on warships that were sunk. So a lot of the graves, which these ships are, graves for Japanese, graves for Americans, for Aussies, and so forth, have been raided by unscrupulous salvagers who want to cash in. And so they don't treat the ships with any respect at all. They just strip them. In any event, Guadalcanal is a test of will between the Americans and the Japanese in the same way that Stalingrad is a test of will between the Germans and the Russians. And it is interesting that the battles parallel each other so much, although, again, much smaller scale on Guadalcanal. We'll talk more tomorrow. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay. Thank you for your attention.